Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to BiblioTech On Air, BiblioTech Public Library's official podcast. I'm Rosanna.
I'm Lewis.
And I'm Romeo.
And today we're going to be talking about our most recent pick for Libros and Libations, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee by Dee Brown.
And just a little summary before we get into it. First published in 1970, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee generated shockwaves with its frank and heartbreaking depiction of the systematic annihilation of American Indian tribes across the western frontier. In this nonfiction account, Dee Brown focuses on betrayals, battles, and massacres suffered by American Indians between 1860 and 1890. He tells of many tribes and their renowned chiefs, from Geronimo to Red Cloud, Sitting Bull to Crazy Horse, who struggle to combat the destruction of their people and culture. And this book is available on Hoopla and Cloud Library, both, if you are interested in checking it out.
Yep, in ebook and audio. So by the end of this podcast, if you want to check it out, make sure you hit up our resources. But I'd say we get right into our questions and thoughts about this book.
Yeah, absolutely. So I wanted to mention before we get into the questions, like you mentioned, it was published in 1970. So I guess the scholarship up until that point had just been the narrative of the Native American being a savage and you know, brutal, and the brutality of the Native Americans. So it's important to note that this retelling, I guess you could say, of history was not the traditional, hey, the winner tells the history, right? It's told from the indigenous perspective as well. So I think it's important to note that. So how does Dee Brown challenge the traditional narratives of American history in Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee? And what do you think is the importance of telling history from the perspective of indigenous people?
I feel like there's, especially because this book did come out like in like 1970. And as you said, a lot of the narratives were focused around like, okay, well, you know, how did the white settlers, like, how did they get to this point? How did they claim the land that was like rightfully theirs? You know,
Sure.
I feel like it's so important to be able to focus the story on the people who lost the most and got betrayed out of like every promise they were ever given by people who kept on moving the goalpost of like, okay, if you do such and such, we'll respect you, we'll leave you alone. Or like, if you move here, then we won't decimate your people and your culture.
Yeah.
And I think that being able to tell that from the perspective of the Native Americans and being able to know how they felt about all of it, but also just like what they did to fight back, how they felt about like what was the best move for them when there was really no winning in so many situations. I think that's very crucial.
Yeah.
Yeah, same with, you know, it's important to hear the voices of these marginalized communities. And I think it was you who had mentioned it at Libros, that this was a time where like the whole cowboys and Indians, you know, the Westerns.
Correct.
They were huge. So for something so, you know, you could call it pretty progressive to come out around this time, that's huge. And the pushback must have been, you know,
Tremendous, yeah. So I mentioned like Gene Autry and Roy Rogers, and you know the traditional cowboy versus Indian, right? Those kinds of narratives. I mean, our youth, the United States, was indoctrinated by seeing these films and reading these romanticized histories. But at this time as well, in the 60s and going into the 70s, there was a new movement called the New Left movement. So you had historians like Dee Brown, Howard Zinn, Eugene Genovese, who literally flipped history on its head and like told it from the perspective of the people who didn't win the wars or the battles and stuff like that. And some people asked yesterday at our discussion last night at Libros that, you know, how do we know if these stories are real? And I said, well, I mean, the retelling from their people survived, right? There were actual witnesses, Native American witnesses, and there were white settlers as well who were advocates of the Native Americans who actually wrote a lot of what went down and stuff. But those were omitted histories, right? Ostracized histories. So for Dee Brown to tell it so bluntly, it was really a tough pill to swallow for a lot of Americans at that time, to be honest.
because also is Dee Brown, is he Caucasian?
You know what? That's a good question. I don't know. I'm not certain. I honestly, I didn't think to look at his, you know, color, ethnicity. I didn't think about that. I just thought, you know, this guy's writing something that's
because also that
amazing.
adds a whole nother dimension. If he's like a Native American at the time getting
That's
this
true.
massive story out, or if he's, you know, like you said, mentioned part of that New Left movement, if he's, like a white American,
Yeah.
kind of bringing these issues to light too. Like with, there's a lot of comparison to Killers of the Flower Moon as well.
Yeah.
How
Mhm.
David Grann, he told a lot of those stories. So those, knowing that we had read that book before
Sure.
and then reading this, it brings up a lot of the same sentiments.
It really does. It really does. So, and you mentioned, Rana Louis, that the book emphasizes the impact of broken treaties a lot. You talked about the broken promises. So,
Yeah.
how does the U.S. government's broken promises affect the lives of Native American tribes? And do you think this history still affects Indigenous communities today?
Absolutely. There's a lot of their family history that's, based off of their losses around moving.
Yeah.
A lot of these communities, their poverty level is so low, and that's because of the crap deal that they got cut. They have high rates of alcoholism, of depression.
Mhm.
And that's still something that's affecting them today. Like, sure, you hear about like the casinos and how much money that brings into the community, but that's such a small portion of it.
Correct.
Yeah. And there's just not a lot of support for those communities in
Mhm.
general.
Yeah.
Like, not to say that like we need to choose like one or the other, like who has more priority, but just like in general, in terms of like activism that I've seen like pop up a lot, especially during my lifetime and especially within the last 5 years,
Mhm.
there has not been as great a push towards also recognizing like the struggles that Indigenous populations are going through.
Yeah.
And I feel like that is, obviously a huge shame just because it has just completely reverberated through the generations of like, it started as like they're being forced onto reservations as a matter of preserving any amount of their preserving their lives, preserving their culture, preserving their people at all. If there was no like forced assimilation into it, if there was
Mhm.
no loss of language, loss of culture,
Yeah.
loss of stories, enforced by the like moving to the reservation or being forced upon, like having that forced upon them.
Yeah.
And I feel like that just, it completely wipes out or like reduces the amount of people who can carry on certain stories, traditions, stuff like that to just such a small amount. There's so many languages that have gone just practically extinct
Yeah.
Yeah.
from just the horrible decisions.
Yeah. And speaking of carrying on, you can fact check me, whoever's listening, but I know I read I think it was Science Magazine, it might have been on Wired. So they're starting to discover that DNA gets imprinted through generational trauma, and it takes up to 3 generations for you to erase that trauma.
Yep.
So if it's being passed down from generation to generation, it's almost like so generational trauma we know is real.
Yeah.
And in this case, they're starting to see that it's imprinted in your actual DNA. So that's crazy. So, and then one of the things they don't talk about, and this book doesn't touch on it, it's coming to light now, is the femicide, right?
Yeah.
The Native American women who have just literally been massacred, murdered,
Mhm.
gone missing, and no effort is put into locating them and figuring out who killed them. You know what I mean? It's a really sad history. When you look at, I guess, considering how many people were here when quote unquote America was discovered, from millions of these indigenous men and women to just such small amounts
Yeah.
these days.
And not to
Yeah.
mention a lot of this stuff, it's still fairly recent. It's been happening continuously over the centuries, and some of this stuff was happening as early as like the 1900s.
Yeah.
But that, if you think about that, that's only 100 years ago.
Yep.
And like you mentioned with the 3 generational thing, that's still very, I guess, in the middle of, for a lot of those families.
Yeah, it's still at the forefront, I'm sure, right? All that
Mhm.
trauma.
Mhm.
It's crazy. So in what ways does the book humanize the Native American tribes and their leaders, such as Sitting Bull and Red Cloud? Did any particular leader or event resonate with you more deeply, and why?
I mean, for sure, because like we touched on earlier and yesterday at Libros, a lot of these Native American tribes, and they were portrayed as, savages,
Yeah.
as, just, oh, they don't know any better, or they're the enemy. And it's something that we kind of learned in growing up in like the educational system too.
Yeah.
Unless you had a really good teacher or someone, or you decided yourself to go outside and learn more about, these, the other side of the manifest destiny. There you go.
Sure.
You really don't get the full scope of it. And I think that bringing a lot of this to light, such as, some of some of the other names that we might not have known either, or the leaders, like with I was talking to you about it before, like with Manuelito.
Mm-hmm.
I had no idea about this gentleman until this book.
Yeah.
And and then some of the other ones who they weren't fighting to fight. They weren't fighting to like cause problems, most of them.
Sure.
But they were just fighting as a result of the treatment they were getting.
Yeah.
And I would say that's pretty human,
Yeah.
You're not, I would assume most people aren't going to fight until provoked.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Something that resonated with me the most was just, I believe it was with the Cheyennes, and I can't remember his name, but there was the chief or leader who was given the American flag and told like, hey, as long as that you have this like as long as you have this like where you're at and you like display it where it can be seen, people are not going to come after you.
Yeah.
People are going to know that you are an ally of ours, and like that is going to be just like a symbol of like that you're like basically like that you're quote unquote one of the good ones.
Yeah.
And he very thoroughly believed like, okay, I am being given this protection. It says that it was like his prized possession, and he goes up to the line of like the cavalry, and he just wants to talk.
Yeah.
And he has the flag like with him, and he just wants to talk to them, and it is completely misconstrued as like he is going to attack us or they didn't care, one way or another, which also likely.
Yeah.
And they just completely shoot him down, even though he was like fully assured that he was going to be protected because he had been, again, given a promise that was broken, because why would they keep that promise, I guess, if they didn't feel like they owed the Native Americans anything at all.
Yeah.
And it's genuinely so heartbreaking, you know?
It was the thought, like you mentioned, to manifest destiny. We are destined. We're a destined people. We're a destined country to keep going and to conquer all the way to the Pacific, right? And I think we talked about last night too. A lot of it was just the indoctrination and assimilation. The Christianity was a big thing, right? Hey, if you had Jesus in your life, like you'll be saved. You're a savage. You need to do this, and then the schooling, and then changing their names. Yep. They literally stripped them from everything, right? Their names, their culture, their histories, their stories, and it's just like, and they still didn't give a crap about them, to be honest. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's really sad. So, what role does the idea of land play in the conflicts presented in the book? How does the loss of land reflect deeper cultural, spiritual, and personal losses for Native Americans?
I mean, they had the belief that the land doesn't belong to anyone, and we also mentioned that they would have the Native American chiefs like sign these treaties.
Yeah.
But why would they sign a treaty for something that doesn't belong to them? But the Americans didn't see it like that.
Yeah. And what is a treaty to them? They didn't deal in treaties, right?
Yeah.
Signatures, and to them it's like, what is this? But I think you mentioned like they signed it a lot of times because like, I'm saving my people. If they say they're going to honor this, then we have to believe they are. And
they did not.
They pretty much never did. So
yeah. And I just feel like there is obviously there's a deep like cultural tie to the land, even if they do not see themselves as owning it. That is where their dead is buried. This is where they've set up their home. This is where like they've lived for countless generations before, and now just being forced to like not only in a way abandon your dead and abandon your home, but also knowing that where you're going to be forced to go does not have enough resources to provide for your people, provide for you.
Yeah.
Knowing that where you're going is going to basically that you're being completely deprived of your home and your culture, just by being forced away from a place that has been home to you for so long.
Yeah.
I feel like this book does really put a lot of like proper weight onto how even the idea of having to leave where they leave their homes impacted everybody, and how many different people had to kind of grapple with the fact of like, is it worth it to leave this place that has been not ours, but like that has been providing for us for so long for the sake of literally letting us survive, like which outweighs the other, which priority outweighs the other, you know?
Right. And you see how much that even caused like internal strife between them. Could you see some of the tribes break up into like their own factions or someone betray the chief or one of the other factions? I mean, when kind of like you said, like, you know, you're getting pushed off your land, but then you see what they do with the land, you know, they're not being respectful of it. They're not conserving. They're just pushing you off your home and then tearing down everything you knew.
Yeah. Somebody comes on the, you know, even today, if somebody comes into my house, I'm not necessarily, I'm not going to greet anybody with violence, but if you come into my house and start saying, you got to get out of here, like, too bad, we're taking over. I'm like, what? You know,
get out of my house.
Yeah. So naturally, like you mentioned, the factions broke off because some Native Americans felt like maybe the chief wasn't being strong enough, or they weren't willing to fight. We need to fight for these quote unquote lands or the place that provides for us. And I don't blame them. It's like, who really is the savage, right? This book talks a lot about what was done to the Native Americans and how essentially, you know, they would chop them up into pieces and just brutalize their men and their women and their children. And I'm thinking here, like, they're savages, they're brutal. Like, the treatment they're receiving is just beyond it's fathomable. You know what I mean? It's like, wow.
And not to mention, we're projecting.
Yeah. And not to mention so many, you know, especially so many accounts that were being used to be able to like justify the whole like the Native Americans are savages thing was in a lot of cases, if it was the Native Americans brutalizing the people that they were fighting, like the white men that they were fighting, if it was them brutalizing them, it was almost always you did this to us first.
Correct.
And we are sending a message.
Correct.
But we don't hear the account of what happened to the Native Americans in the first place. So it really lends to the narrative of like, okay, they're savages. Look what they did to all of like the white men that they were fighting.
Yeah.
You know, but it was to send a message, and it was kind of a retaliation thing. Like, you brutalized us in this way. And it's like, yeah, like I feel like a lot of things that like were justifying the savage narrative really could have used that first piece of context, but I can also understand why they wouldn't have included that.
Yeah.
You know?
So speaking of retaliation, so throughout the book, the U.S. military uses violence and deceit as tools of conquest. How do you think the dehumanization of Native Americans contributed to these actions? But I want to note, too, that the United States government selected the U.S. military to go and perform these operations or whatever. They could have used local militiamen. They could have gone a different route with the governors of certain states that were around at the time, but they decided to specifically send the military. Why do you think that was? And what do you think this dehumanization of Native Americans contributed to these actions?
Propaganda. Definitely a lot of propaganda.
Think so?
You know, because you send the military, people are going to be like, yay, you know, we're going to support our military and what we're doing. Look at that, the American flag.
Yeah. And I feel like it also, again, it sends a message of like, this is not like this local militia of this particular region is against the Native Americans. It sends the message of like, the government that has now supplanted itself in your land is against you. It has thousands of men who are willing to fight. Like like they said, they compare them to locusts. They just, you kill a few, they keep showing up, They're like a plague, you know, they literally are just showing like a display of power of like the government is against you. It is against your existence. And we are going to employ thousands of people that we have at our disposal to continue doing this. And eventually you're not gonna have anybody left.
Intimidation tactics.
Yeah. It's the full weight of the federal government coming to you, right? The full backing, you know, funding, whatever you want to call it. I mean, it was just like, do it, you know?
Yeah.
For the betterment of our country or whatever. So Brown focuses on the voices of the Native American tribes, but also describes the perspectives of white settlers and soldiers. How does this multi-perspective approach influence the reader's understanding of the conflict? I think it is important. We talked about it last night. So we have to be honest, right? Every white settler that was there was not a bad person.
Yeah.
Some of them were allies and advocates of the Native Americans. And, you know, it's their retelling too, right? Because a lot of them were there too. So what do you think about having the multiple perspectives told in this book?
I mean, I think that it is ultimately a really good thing because in stories of resistance and stories of like talking about the oppression of like a minority population, it is also always good to know that like it is not just that group fighting alone.
Mhm.
There are always going to be people, regardless, who will see what they are going through
Mhm.
and either be educated about this, even though they had like misconceptions before,
Sure.
or who have, like, there were several people mentioned in the book who grew up with Native Americans, or just like in one way or another knew those populations and knew those tribes,
Mhm.
and were there advocating, they're interpreting, they're being allies, and I think it's very important to be able to know that it wasn't just the Native Americans fighting it alone.
Yeah. I agree.
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely probably not probably, but it was definitely a minority that supported
Sure.
the Native Americans. But like Lewis said, it definitely was important to know that they weren't alone in this.
Yeah.
They had at least a little bit of support outside, or maybe someone advocating. Like there's a few moments in the book where you do hear about some of the white settlers being like, they're not bad. Like they've been helping us, or they haven't had anything to do with the fighting that's going on.
We're alive because of them.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think a lot of it too is just like you mentioned, propaganda, right? You've never actually encountered a Native American tribe, and then you're hearing it from other people. They're this or that. And it was very brave of them to speak out at that time, because I'm sure it was so frowned upon, probably even illegal. I don't know the laws at the time, but to speak out against what was going on. You know what I mean? So I think a lot of these white settlers, a lot of them were probably seeing this and thinking, this is not good. This is not right. We don't just kill people this way. We're Christians.
Mhm.
But then like not being brave enough at times to speak up.
Yeah.
And those that did speak up, it was like, wow, more power to you. You actually said something about it.
And who's to
Yeah.
say those people that didn't speak up didn't get the same kind of treatment?
Exactly.
Like maybe they were hanged, or maybe they were like, we're going to lock you away. We don't
Yep.
like what you're saying.
Exactly. That's not good for American spirit.
Yeah.
So this book is a reminder of the historical injustices faced by Native Americans. How can reading Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee impact contemporary discussions on reparations and social justice?
I mean, I was kind of touching on it earlier, but just like, I feel like that reading this book and like knowing this kind of side of the story for it is like, I think that it's really important to listen to the voices and the accounts of people who have been going through things, and knowing how brutal things are, but also knowing that, again, there are multiple ways that they have tried to get through this. There are multiple ways that they have tried to preserve their culture over the years.
Yeah.
Knowing that there is a struggle in the first place if you are completely unaware, and I feel like it's important to see also those accounts of allyship and be like, that could be me. I can help, or if you are a person who is part of an oppressed group, or even specifically, like if you're a Native American reading this, knowing that like there are stories that have survived, there are perspectives from people generations ago that reflect like the pain that you went through, but also the actual fight entailed.
Mhm.
I think it's very important to be able to note like all across the board what like the actual truth of what happened.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And the fact that we're still talking about this book today and these stories today, that just goes to show how much their longevity and their importance resonates with people. Like you mentioned, whether you're part of a Native American descendants around today, or a different marginalized group, stories like this are always going to be important to preserve.
Yeah, absolutely. And we talked about it last night too. I don't think we talked about, the ancestors of settlers at the time who may have committed some of these atrocities. Like to this day, are we holding them accountable? And a lot of us kind of came to the conclusion that at a minimum, just acknowledging that it happened. I mean, maybe a sorry won't go as far, won't do a whole lot, but just acknowledging, that did happen and that was wrong. And, obviously we can't change it now, but it did happen. Just an acknowledgement of that is so powerful for those communities and Native Americans to hear that, yeah, it happened. We're not done. We know it happened.
Yeah, because it's not going to fall to us to make those judgments. Ultimately, it's going to be the Native community themselves on whether they want to accept these apologies or not.
Sure.
Yeah.
And again, that recognition is a good step forward.
It is.
And I know we talked about reparations as well.
Yeah.
We're unlikely to see any kind of, financial reparation go to these people
Sure.
for probably a while, if ever. but we can kind of take that initiative, or at least, kind of step up when we see something wrong happening. And, it's not going to be the same,
Yeah.
but it's like you mentioned, allyship.
Yeah, we can do what we can to prevent further harm. But also, I feel like having a book like this, and I'm sure so many more since this one like hit the scene, and like more literature, especially by specifically people who are Native American. Basically, just like I feel like it's important to highlight things like this, just so whenever people are looking to make reparations, it's not just them, I don't know, making legislation without anybody present from the groups that they're trying to like issue apologies and reparations to. I feel like since it highlights Native American voices, I feel like it's a good start in, considering maybe if we are looking to make reparations, maybe if we are looking into the like land back movement, stuff like that, actually centering voices of Native American people who know better than the rest of us what should be done in that case and what they would prefer. Not that they're a monolith, but like just getting their opinion on this,
Yeah, you made a good point, though. This book was definitely, it opened the gates for other historians and researchers and inquirers to really find out more about what they hadn't been told up until that point, right? The omission and stuff. And of course, there were some historians that just were like, no, like this is, BS. And because they actively chose to omit these histories and ignore what really happened and stuff like that. So it's really remarkable that this story was published when it was, and it made the impact that it did. So at several points, Brown mentions the U.S. government's efforts to erase Native American culture, such as through forced assimilation policies. We talked about this. So how do you think these efforts impacted the survival of Native American cultures? And talk about the resilience to, even though millions were wiped off the face of this earth, like they're still here. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I mean, we saw, like you mentioned earlier, we've seen languages and cultures go extinct as a result of, trying to completely obliterate and just hide Native American culture. But that just goes to show the strength and, like you mentioned, the resilience that these different Native Americans and tribes had. Like they made it a point, whether it was out in the open as a form of protest or, maybe kind of in the quiet of their homes after, being part of white American culture.
Sure.
They made an effort to preserve these stories, these songs, their art, their way of life.
Yeah.
They might have been like almost squashed, but not completely. And it's inspiring to see how much that's persisted.
Yeah. It can be so tough with cultures that are so that can be so not dependent, that's not the word I'm looking for, but very like it is ingrained within the culture itself of oral history, storytelling, language, very like visual storytelling also, especially with kind of like a, like honestly, just like a Eurocentric, white-centric kind of point of view where written history is like, that is the way that we record things. It can be so vulnerable in a way to have the main way that your traditions, your culture, your language is passed down to be in the form of oral history, to be in the form of more visual representation, because those sort of things are more vulnerable to being like overwritten, literally. And I can only imagine how much was lost, especially during this time period, of just like those, like the bedrock foundation of like, here are things that we've known for generations, here are things that have been a part of our culture for generations. There's every likelihood that there is just so much that we don't know, and that the the descendants of these people will never know about their culture because of just, hard to relay oral history when the person is not there anymore.
Yeah, it's just gone. It's gone. And I highly recommend anybody who ever goes out to Washington, D.C., at least once in your life, the National Museum for the American Indian. It's amazing. It's there in the National Mall. I've been there. It's like, I think 6 levels, and it's just amazing that they're able to, recognize the Native American there in D.C., right? Which is where our federal government is and stuff. It's an amazing opportunity. So anybody gets a chance, I highly recommend that. So, so what were your overall thoughts on the book? Did you like it or dislike it?
I liked it. I was talking to Rosanna. I love nonfiction, but I have kind of a blind spot when it comes to literal historical accounts.
Sure.
Just because a lot of names, a lot of dates, stuff like that.
It is. It's heavy.
Yeah, it is heavy.
Yeah.
Like it is dense in the way of like the pure amount of information.
Yeah.
But it's also heavy in terms of the topic.
Sure.
But here's the thing. I'm very glad that because of this podcast recording that I did check it out.
Yeah.
Because it is a topic that I will admit I did not know a lot about going into it, especially that time period, especially going through school, very glossed over.
Oh yeah.
You know, and I do think there's a lot of value in reading accounts like this, even if it's not something that sticks with my brain the way that a lot of other books can.
Yeah.
I do need to finish it.
Yeah.
I don't know if we want to keep that, but like I genuinely am going to finish it.
Sure.
You know, it's something that I want to work through a little bit slower.
Yeah.
Just so I can really process it all instead of like cramming.
Yeah.
You know?
It's a tough read. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll tell you, I have 2 degrees in history, and not unless you had a major focus in Native American history. I mean, like you mentioned, even at the university level, it was just glossed over. You know, Texas history is always there.
Yeah.
The traditional romanticized version of United States history is always there. So being more micro history, focusing on that is where it is. But it is, to me though, it's also a testament to what Dee Brown accomplished at that time.
Yeah.
How he had to scour through probably these, you know, archives and personal archives and just finding these, you know, primary documents to be able to bring this story to life. I think it's a testament to his courage as well, being able to do that at that time. So
absolutely.
Yeah.
Right. Especially seeing all like the footnotes at the end and stuff.
Yeah.
Like it was, when I finally got to that point, I was like, oh, okay.
Yeah, definitely.
That's definitely a lot to look into. But it was informative. It was repetitive, but not in a bad way. It was repetitive in the unfortunate way that this is how history played out.
Yeah.
I agree with Louis where like there were some points where like dates and names got a little muddled because it's a lot to take in. And it's a frustrating read also just because of the injustice of it all.
Yeah.
But it's good. It's informative. And if this is kind of like your first foray into learning more about, you know, the treatment of Native Americans, then by all means look into it.
Yeah, and I do think it's a really good read to have as like your if it is your first time learning about the deeper history of this of this era, especially because a lot of people's basis is, well, I learned in high school that this was about where Manifest Destiny happened and like the Native Americans were all put into like one place and there's the Trail of Tears and then they're there and they've been there for like centuries.
Yeah.
Like I feel like it's a good way to give yourself greater historical context about that time, about a group that does not get talked about quite as much. And I think that definitely pace yourself.
Sure.
But I absolutely recommend it just because I feel like every chapter also opens with like, this is the year, these things happen on these dates in this year. And it really places you in, even with things that are unrelated completely to what is happening with the Native Americans, it will give you greater historical context of like, this is what this year was like. And we're going to go bit by bit, letting you know when these things happened to the Native Americans. Like it's very well composed.
And that was done intentionally from the reviews and interviews I read, was done intentionally to place the reader in that, like you said, the historical context in that time to know, okay, wow, like for example, this didn't happen, right? But for example, the automobile was around this time, but we were still killing Native Americans.
Right.
That's kind of the context he wanted to put it in. And I thought it was really good. I also recommend the book. Obviously, I'm very biased. I love books like this. I've been reading them for a long time. But I just think it's like you mentioned, Rosanna, it's something, it might be heavy for a lot to start with, but I think it's a really good introduction into the mistreatment, or that's just the treatment, right, of Native Americans at that time and how they were just eradicated and, moved off their lands for a long time.
Yeah.
So, and my last question is, I want to know what you all are currently reading, if you're reading anything.
I'm currently reading a couple of mangas. I'm reading a little bit of the JJK manga because I freaking love that anime. And I'm reading the first volume of Kaiju number 8. But and we were talking about it. I
Yeah.
want to get started on The Life We Bury, which is our next Libros pick. So shameless plug, but also I really do want to get started on that because the premise sounds interesting.
Yeah.
And it's a fairly short read.
It is 8.5 hours. I think it's about just a quick synopsis. It's about a young man who has the task for a college class to interview an older person, but he goes to a nursing home and ends up interviewing a man who was convicted of rape and murder 30 years prior. So it's supposed to be pretty interesting.
We're going to use that exact bit for our intro next podcast.
There you go. Just copied it. I'm currently reading Bad Mexicans, Race, Empire, and Revolution in the Borderlands by Kelly Lito Hernandez. In college, I did a project about the Flores Magón movement, the Magonistas. So even though Magón himself wasn't an active participant in terms of fighting during the Mexican Revolution, it was his movement and the call for, hey, let's rise up and let's strike that got others, the Carancistas, the Villistas, to kind of fight and, rise up and stuff. It's a really interesting book. And it all took place in, the 956 where I'm from. A lot of it did. So.
Oh, in the Valley.
Yeah.
Oh, nice.
From Laredo to all the way to Brownsville. So, yeah.
That's cool.
Good stuff.
I am about to start the Black Count, Glory, Revolution, Betrayal, and the Real Count of Monte Cristo by Tom Rice.
Nice.
I love Count of Monte Cristo very much. And I, for reasons I will not disclose, looking a little bit more into the history of Count of Monte Cristo. Stay tuned. But it is a book about Alexander Dumas, the author of Count of Monte Cristo, and his father, General Alexander Dumas, who the Count of Monte Cristo and characters from the Three Musketeers were based on. So
Nice.
I'm excited to start that.
Interesting.
Nice.
Good.
All right, that's going to wrap it up for our latest episode on the Libros pick for Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee by Dee Brown. Check it out on our resources, Cloud Library and Hoopla. And be sure to stay tuned for our next pick, The Life We Bury, again, available on our resources, Cloud Library, and I believe Hoopla as well?
Hoopla as well, yeah,
Okay.
by Alan Eskins. Yes, correct.
Okay, cool, by Alan Eskin. So make sure you check that out if you want to be up to date with our next episode. And we'll be meeting in about a month.
Yep.
Over at Burleson. So thank you guys again for listening to our episode. And we'll catch you guys on the next recording. I'm Rosanna.
I'm Lewis.
And I'm Romeo.
Bye.